This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Welcome back to the Andrew Lawton Show. Certainly, we've been doing our part to hold the government to account throughout this crisis and beyond the crisis as well. But the person who has the official task at hand of doing that is Andrew Scheer, the leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition, leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. He joins me on the line now from Ottawa. Mr. Scheer, good to talk to you again. Thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
So let's talk first off about what your role is here, because I think there's a lot of, I'll say, concern from people that whenever you criticize the government, you're violating what the government has established and what you've established as being that Team Canada spirit.
Well, of course, in a crisis like this, when Canadians want to see their institutions work and they want to see collaboration and people put aside differences, of course, the nature of the opposition has changed as well. We're keeping our focus on the health crisis, on the pandemic, the economic fallout from that. But that doesn't mean that it's not healthy to be challenged or to be corrected. We've had a number of examples where the Liberals have announced a program, major shortcomings and gaps. We've called for action. We've raised our voice, represented people who are falling through those cracks, and we've seen the government amend their approach. So it's still essential. It's not just healthy, it's essential in a democracy to have the government being challenged and held to account to make sure that they get it right.
Let's talk about how they're not doing that in your view, because one of the big problems I've been seeing and talking especially to small business owners is that all of these relief measures that have come out, whether it's the emergency response benefit, the wage subsidy, the emergency business account, for starters, the graduation of this. It's not all been about here's a program, apply for it. Every step of the way, it seems like the programs needed to be rejigged and revamped. But even still, with every one of these changes, there are huge swaths of Canadians, sole proprietors in particular, that seem to be excluded from these programs. And I know that you're in a bit of a tricky situation in that you're in an opposition role, so you can ask the government to change it and you can vote against stuff theoretically when Parliament is sitting. But what's your read on this? I mean, do you think that there are too many Canadians that are in between these programs?
For sure. And one of our frustrations is that the government makes an announcement. We start pointing out gaps. They say, well, we'll look at that. And then a week or two later, they make the changes. What we'd like them to do is to show us their legislation, show us their programs while it's still in the design phase. And I'm not just talking about Conservative MPs, every single MP is hearing from small business owners, contractors, owner-operators, and they're getting that feedback in real time saying, my company's not eligible for that, or I'm not eligible for that. While these programs are still being designed, members of Parliament are the best focus group there is when it comes to this type of thing, because we're in our communities, we're hearing from people directly. So we'd like to see them bring us in on the front end. We believe that would provide more clarity. And one of the toughest things right now is when you talk to people and they say, I haven't paid my rent this month, we're halfway through, I don't know what my landlord is going to do to me, I don't know what I'm going to be eligible for, I don't have any cash flow because I haven't had a customer in over 30 days. The government tells me not to worry that more is coming, but my credit card's getting maxed out, and I just, there's a real sense of urgency here, and that's what we're going to continue to push for is getting it right the first time as much as possible.
One of the big things right now, of course, you and the Conservatives pushing for more parliamentary oversight, having more sessions like the couple of emergency sessions we've had thus far with a more pared down, bare bones caucus arrangement from all parties. The concern that I have with this is that given it is taking so long to get it right and multiple drafts, multiple revisions, does pushing for these sessions not prolong the gaps here and ultimately make it more difficult for Canadians in need of these supports to access them?
Well, I actually believe it can have the opposite effect. When you have regular question periods, when you have ministers in the chamber, you're allowing for members of Parliament to get up on a Monday and say, hey, I've got a letter here from a constituent who says that they're ineligible. We need to do something about this. They'll hear that in public. They'll see the other MPs saying the same thing. And throughout the week, they can come back with the fixes. What's happening now is that there's very little ability to communicate directly with the ministers. We've had in the past month or so, we've had a few conference calls, we've had a few appearances at committee here in the House. So regular accountability sessions, I actually believe, will speed up the development process of these programs and get them right the first time, because the members of parliament will be doing a lot of the work for the government. We'll be identifying the gaps for them, saying, hey, these are the types of people that need assistance here, and that can help on the front end design these programs in a better way.
A couple of weeks ago, Health Minister Patty Hajdu said, her words, no indication, unquote, that the numbers from China about the death toll and infection rate of COVID-19 there couldn't be trusted. This morning, of course, we have acknowledgement from Wuhan that their numbers were wrong. They've revised them and increased them by 50%, so quite a significant correction here. And still, when asked, Justin Trudeau would not address the lack of really reliability of China's numbers, and that was at his Friday press conference. Now, I know you have been very skeptical of China on this and on many things, and I think is necessary in Canada, but what do you make of it that the government, even when China admits its numbers were wrong, still won't accept that China's data are anything less than trustworthy?
It is outrageous, and I think the former ambassadors from Canada to China put it best when they said this is an embarrassing posture. It's an embarrassing position for Canada to be more apologetic for the Chinese regime than the Chinese regime itself is. But this is all part of Justin Trudeau's view. He admires the basic dictatorship of China. He went to China seeking a free trade deal when our free trade with the U.S. was being threatened. He refuses to respond to the fact that there are 2 Canadians being held illegally. China's put blocks on our exports of canola. This government has yet to respond in any way. I don't trust anything coming out of a communist government. I don't trust anything that comes out of a government like the regime in China on anything. Now we're making life and death decisions about how we're going to respond to the pandemic here, and the source information is coming from China. So I think it's time to ensure that our decisions are based on a more broad sources of information, much more broadly than just the WHO. At this time, there are Canadian experts who have called for different action earlier. The Canadian Military Intelligence Report that warned us that this virus was going to be big. So it's continuing. It's just very confusing. It's not confusing. It's outrageous. It's unacceptable for the government to continue to vouch for China. I mean, Minister Hajdu was asked specifically about the quality of the data. She vouched for the government of China. It's ridiculous.
Well, and that's ultimately been, I think, the stopgap here that a lot of people have said as well, the World Health Organization numbers, not China's numbers. Well, when the World Health Organization is populating its data from the numbers received from China without question, we have to look at their reliability problem. And I guess the question that I would put to you, Mr. Scheer, is if you were Prime Minister now, what would you do to reevaluate that relationship, not just with China, but with the WHO? Because there's been a lot of deference to them as an international body that right now I don't think squares up with where most people would say their credibility is.
Exactly. And remember, this is the same agency that a few years ago hired Robert Mugabe to be the Goodwill Ambassador. So these organizations, especially the ones that come through the United Nations, when we look at the types of countries that have so much influence at the United Nations and the institutions that are affiliated with it, they don't share our values. They don't share our democratic principles. We have to view things that come out of that with a great deal of skepticism. And as you say, when the World Health Organization data is populated by data from China, garbage in, garbage out. We have to have a healthier dose of skepticism when we're looking at that. That's why when we have our domestic agencies, our military intelligence warning us, we have to give greater weight. We have to take that more seriously when it's coming from our experts here that we can trust, that we know don't have a political agenda when they're providing raw data to officials. And what I would like to see is this government ensure that Canadian officials at the WHO answer for their actions. Remember, it was a Canadian official in a press conference who pretended that he didn't hear a question about Taiwan, but whether or not Taiwan would be included in the WHO's efforts. Just absolutely bizarre to watch. It was like something out of an old, movie about the Soviet Union, pretending not to hear the question, pretending that there was difficulty on the connection, then moving on to the next question. Why would a Canadian official act like that? Are Canadian officials trying to protect the government of China? why not stand up for Taiwan and its need to have participation in the global fight against this pandemic? So a lot of serious questions, and our government needs to be held accountable for their dependence on the WHO and their refusal to hold China accountable.
I think a lot of that brings us to skepticism that I think is growing with Dr. Theresa Tam as well. And I think it's important to note she's not a politician, or at least not supposed to be a politician, but she does have a seat at the WHO. She's been very linked to the WHO through a number of committees and other projects. She's also the most vocal member of the Canadian government, apart from Justin Trudeau, I'd say, and Chrystia Freeland, on matters of Canada's response to the coronavirus. Do you think there is a conflict of interest there, that this woman is beholden to the WHO as well as to Canada?
Well, we certainly want to get answers as to why there is so much contradictory information. Early on, the recommendation from our own agency here was not to impose travel restrictions. Early on, the instructions from Dr. Tam was that not to wear masks. So there certainly have been contradictory messages. We need to look at how China has influence on many different types of institutions. Obviously, the WHO is front and center right now. In addition to that, there's been a lot of alarms raised about influencing universities. There's been intelligence reports about how the government of China influences other types of civil society. There's been warnings from countries like Australia about how they've perceived the threat of influence from the government of China. I think anytime you have Canadian officials that are wearing two hats or involved in 2 or 3 different organizations, we have to be very sure that there are accountability measures put in place. I don't believe that we should let the government off the hook and let them pin all the blame on Dr. Tam here. There needs to be common sense filters applied to things. We had a shocking news story this week that the government, after the 2015 election, the Liberal government dumped millions of pieces of personal equipment from the pandemic stockpile. The previous Conservative government had built up this stockpile, regularly rotated, making sure that it was all up to date and none of it was expired. This government cut by tens of millions of dollars the budget for that, dumped material without replacing it. So this is the same government that can find $50 million to give to MasterCard, $12 million to Loblaws. But when it comes to making sure that we have enough masks and gowns and gloves in case of a pandemic, from the very department that is responsible for planning a pandemic, it's ridiculous and outrageous. So I don't want this government to be able to scapegoat anybody. They're the ones that didn't apply the common sense test to many of these decisions. They need to be held accountable.
I just want to make sure I understand the point you made earlier in that response, though, Mr. Scheer. Are you saying that the Canadian government or elements of the Canadian government are, in your view, under the influence of the Chinese government, of the Chinese regime?
What I'm saying is that there have been warnings from our security partners about how the government of China tries to influence civil society in Canada, try to influence the conversations about it. Everything from news outlets in terms of some of the publications that have connections to mainland China. So those are the types of things that we say, look, we have to take a look at our relationship with China. This is a regime that has continually showed that it does not share our values. It abuses human rights at home. It has acknowledged that it has engaged in hacking exercises of other governments. It is not being upfront and open and transparent in the middle of a health crisis. Oh, and let's not forget, if we're holding 2 Canadians hostage. So, we've got Canadians literally being held illegally in China. We've got all this body of evidence that they are not, a trusted ally, not a trusted partner, and so many of these things. They're an important trading partner. We need to recognize that we can benefit from trade with them. But I think it's time that we have a rethink of how much confidence and dependency this government seems to place in that regime.
One final question I have for you here. Obviously, this has been a very different year than a lot of people, including the Conservative Party of Canada, thought it was going to be. The leadership race put on hold here. Does anything like that really change the decision that you had made to step down? Or do you think that when the leadership race is restarted, if it is, there's going to be an entirely new scenario that might make you reevaluate your role in the Conservatives?
Well, when I made the decision to step down, it really was because I could see the months ahead and the toll that the last 3 years had taken on my family, and I knew I couldn't do both. I couldn't be a good dad and a good leader of the opposition that was that would have been required to do all the things I had been doing for the past 2 years. When I ran for leadership the first time, I think many people did expect that it would probably take 2 elections. Back in 2015, if you had told Conservatives that we'd hold the Liberals to a minority in the next election, that would have been seen very positively. Obviously, expectations were raised, and the party, while we did very well in many areas, fell short of our goal, which was to form the government. I am very much at peace with the decision I've made. I'm working very hard leading this caucus, making sure that we stay united and focused and ready to hand over the keys to the next leader in a position that will make sure that we can win the next election. But I'm also really enjoying being able to spend time with my family and going to their, well, I'm not going to so many of their activities right now, but before the health crisis hit, it was great to be the one to take them to school events and things like that. So I'm very much looking forward to handing the reins over to the next leader.
Yeah, the silver lining of all of this is even more time with the family than you would imagine. So I appreciate very much that response and your time today, Andrew Scheer, leader of the Conservatives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.